Good evening and hello. This beautiful evening in Manhattan. On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, and my colleagues here at BGC, I welcome you to the Archaeological Encounters seminar series. We're meeting after a prolonged hiatus owing to the pandemic, and for the first time online with a greatly expanded audience, as we are very pleased to see. The series responds to the growing prominence of archaeology at BGC, with novel initiatives to bring fieldwork and heritage into our teaching and research. And our goal is to expand the temporal horizons and to challenge conventional narratives and epistemic boundaries by uncovering the experiences of actors whose roles have been obscured or marginalized. And in that capacity, we respectfully acknowledge our presence on Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York City as a past and future home of indigenous people, as well as others subjected to forced migrations and diasporas. And we hope that in tonight's discussions, we can bring out the important role we can play as archaeologists in calling attention to the realities of colonial dispossession and the destruction of biological diversity. Tonight's seminar will open with two lectures by our visitor, Ruth Tringham and Brian Boyd, and continue with a discussion involving our virtual panel and questions put to us by the audience through the Q&A function, as Laura Minsky just explained. But now, for the time being, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Meredith Lynn, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thanks so much, Casper. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here tonight who's watching near and far. And I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Ruth Tringham. Ruth is a professor of anthropology in the graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on the Neolithic period in Southeastern Europe and Western Asia, and how societies changed socially, economically, and materially with the adoption of agriculture. Her work has had a particular emphasis on houses and the emergence of the household as a primary unit of social reproduction. Ruth has directed the archaeological excavation of several sites in Serbia and Bulgaria, as well as the Berkeley archaeologists at Çatalhöyük project, or the Bach project for short, at the site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey. She's authored many reports, articles, books, and book chapters about these sites, and also about the larger issues of archaeological method and interpretation and pedagogy, including more recently the roles of multisensory experiences, emotion, and storytelling and narrative. Ruth has long used feminist, multivocal, and multisensory perspectives in her work, and she is a leader in employing digital technologies in archaeology, from initial recording in the field, to interpretation, to publication and education. Casper and I were thrilled last year when Ruth visited our digital archaeological heritage course and shared insights from her digital projects with our students and with us. Some of those projects included the prize-winning Remixing Çatalhöyük project and the Okapi Island project, a mirror of Çatalhöyük in the virtual world of Second Life. And she also shared some of her experimental short film projects, or talked about them, featured in her 2019 European Journal of Archaeology article, which I recommend to you. These projects recontextualize primary archaeological data and create significant afterlives for important excavations and engage whole new audiences in the discovery and contemplation of traces of the human past. So we are so pleased to welcome Ruth tonight, albeit virtually, after having to postpone her originally scheduled visit for more than a year due to COVID. So again, welcome, Ruth. We're really happy to have you here tonight and look forward to what you have to share with us. And one of the very positive outcome of this unexpected change is that we had the opportunity to invite Dr. Brian Boyd to present his work tonight, as well as to engage both Brian and Ruth in conversation about work. And you'll see there's some connecting threads. So I will turn the mic over to Casper now to introduce Brian.
Yes, thank you very much. And so Brian Boyd from much nearer than Ruth, our neighbor practically in Columbia. He holds a very wide range of roles at Columbia University as a lecturer in anthropology, director of museum anthropology, and as co-director of the Center of Palestine Studies. And he joined Columbia after teaching at Lampeter in Wales, in the UK, and moved to Columbia in 2006, I was just told. And he had studied previously at Glasgow University and the University of Cambridge, where he earned his doctorate. And he works on a really wide range of very exciting topics, mobilizing under-examined phenomena, relationships, and places to counter simplistic narratives of the past. The work I'm most familiar with through my own research concerns human-animal relations, on which he has published, for instance, in Archaeological Dialogues, and more recently in the Annual Review of Anthropology, an extremely useful review of recent developments in the field. And also more recently, he has worked on sound studies, which is exemplified, for instance, in his World Archaeology article on soundscapes in Moche cities. But what will be most relevant to tonight's paper arises from his long-standing commitment to archaeological fieldwork and critical heritage in Palestine, Israel, concentrating on epi-Paleolithic Natufian lifeways, and more recently on the nationalist politics of archaeological practice manifest in destructive landscape alterations in the West Bank. And he works there in a collaboration between Columbia and the Birzeit University Museum of Anthropology. And I think it is time to hand over to our guests. Ruth?
Okay, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Caspar and Meredith, and thank you for inviting me to collaborate with Brian tonight. It makes a very fun time. Just a brief disclaimer out of respect for those who might be offended or made uncomfortable by images of human skeletal remains. This presentation does include such imagery that is essential to my narrative. If you prefer not to view these images, I have put a warning symbol in the slide that precedes one that displays human remains, starting with this slide. I'm going to start this presentation with a story. Once upon a time, some archaeologists from different parts of the world came together to dig through the debris of a 9,000-year-old village in the middle of Turkey. Now, the village is a mound covered in grass. But once, there were mud brick houses here, whose white plastered walls and floors were renewed each year. The archaeologists peel away the plastered floors of a house with incredible patience, while listening to beautiful music. The house they are digging lies on top of other, earlier houses, and those houses lie on top of yet other, even earlier houses. In fact, when the house that our heroes are excavating was occupied, the village had already existed for 1,000 years. So it's not surprising that they were accustomed to having their relatives, both dead and alive, close by them in this place. They buried the dead relatives under the floors of the houses, digging the burial pits into the fill of the houses below. This is the story of the excavation of one of these ancestors, and what we, or at least one of us, think about as the face of the deceased is revealed. You don't get to hear that story, but there's a Vimeo link down the bottom of this slide if you want to. You might have noticed the fuzziness of the video. That's because it is built with video digitized from tape in 2001. It needs to be replaced by video digitized at a higher resolution. More on this later. Beyond this story, I will talk very little in this presentation about the original journey of the Berkeley archaeologists at Çatalhöyük, the Bach project. This project culminated in this printed monograph. I don't know if you can see it, it's very heavy, I can't hold it up too long. The Last House on the Hill. This print edition cannot be added to or changed, but there are digital ways, as you will see. When we publish such a final report of an archaeological project, we traditionally tend to think of it as the culmination of the project's life journey. But taking inspiration from Karen Sanders, it seems to me to be rather the point of departure from which a new journey begins. Its afterlife. This afterlife will be my focus, the future safety of the project's data and the products of creativity derived from them. In the Last House on the Hill database, we have collected together all the visual media and primary source data that was of necessity left out of the printed monograph report. Each item is recorded as a separate entity in the database with its own URL. All of these entities are held together as an archipelago of places, people, things, including samples, events, and media in a network of relations, what Janet Murray describes in her Hamlet on the Holodeck as an encyclopedic environment that can provide a huge wealth of potential narratives about the Bach project and Building 3 that was its focus. Uniquely for this database, the printed monograph has been incorporated into the database, fragmented into several hundred text identities based on its sections and subsections. Feature 640, the phytolith remains of a basket in a burial, is a place entity and related to several text entities from the monograph you can see listed on a scrolling interface on the left, as well as pages from the PDF version of the book. Below these on the list are below these visible items are related place entities, including units of human remains in the pit, the fill of the pit, and so on, along with its media representations, one of which you can see here in its description, as well as people entities related by their excavation of the feature. You can see details of the structure of the database in the article I've noticed here on the slide. Here, I look at the concept of afterlives in the larger context of the concept of life histories. The life history of an archaeological project does not work exactly in parallel with life histories of people, animals, places, and things. For example, as archaeologists, we tend to reverse engineer the lives of people and buildings, starting at how they ended as archaeological and working backwards from there. In considering the life history of a project, it is very much a forward trajectory, where the aim is not to allow the documents and records of our research to become archaeological. As with all archaeological excavations, however, there comes a point at which a decision has to be made as to what to do with the tangible revealed remains. In the case of Çatalhöyük, mud brick houses. We can leave the revealed building intact, as in a ruin, for visitors to gaze at long after the project is complete, as was done at Çatalhöyük with Building 77 in 2008. Or we can excavate it entirely, revealing a complete document of its life until nothing tangible is left but a hole in the ground, which is then filled in and all is forgotten. This was the option taken with Building 3 of the Bach project. I created this re-photography mashup as an afterlife called How Quickly We Forget, to express the 7 years of our project, forgotten as if they had never been. Building 77, that was not forgotten, goes on to an afterlife as a heritage site for visitors. Meanwhile, the digital source documents of a project are stored, archived, and curated in a database or content management system, in this case, the Bach project database Last House on the Hill. And then they are disseminated, reused, and displayed in various afterlife contexts. From here, depending on its curation practices, the results of the project will carry on living a productive existence in the world, or they might become archaeological again. Becoming archaeological is an increasing practical as well as ethical issue of what to do with all our stuff, including what we bring out of the earth through archaeological excavation, but also including what we create as digital products. Should everything be saved? Should some things be reburied? Should some things, analog or digital, be left to go their own way into oblivion? Like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, for those who might remember that. The two sources below that I've listed on the slide here are just two of many that have drawn attention to the fact that once the source data is forgotten or made meaningless, an essential step in the knowledge-making process is lost. They are just two of the many articles where the steps to prevent such a disaster are voiced. How to prevent data and afterlives becoming archaeological. To make them, the solution is to make them discoverable, meaningful, accessible, usable, used, and remembered. These are questions and solutions that will resonate throughout both our presentations today. The life cycle of a digital entity is at the heart of the solution. This has been well publicized in the last 10 years as the danger of the ephemerality of digital documents has become manifest. Many of the analog sources of information have in these days been converted as legacy projects to digital objects through scanning and other digitizing technologies. The Berkeley project at Çatalhöyük spanned the transformational period of the late 1990s to early 2000s, when most of the data was still born analog. Now, some but by no means all field projects document their research as entirely born digital data. After birth, the digital objects are hopefully made usable by being organized in a content management system or database that is saved and shared through a central repository like the Archaeological Data Service in the UK or in the US TDAR, or a cloud-based system like Amazon. But you cannot sit back and assume your data are safe forever. They need to be constantly curated to ensure their sustainability and longevity. More work is involved in curating legacy data than with born digital data. Digitization technologies, including scanning resolution, develop constantly. So earlier digitized objects, especially images and video, as you saw in the first Afterlife example, that movie I showed, need to be redigitized. So the original analog data, transparencies and tapes need to be kept. First time I'm saying that, it's going to come back. The curation cycle that has been created and clearly explained in the Digital Curation Center's website insists that there is one final step that in the curation model that was not always forefronted as it is now. These data need to be accessed and made discoverable and usable. That is the role of Afterlives of a project, including publications and more creative forms of recontextualization of the data. For the most part, the Afterlives play a passive role as consumers of data, but they do also have an important role of giving a rejuvenating jolt to the data, increasing their discoverability and acting as a guide to the data's meaningfulness, thus increasing their use and longevity. If this is not done, If any or all of these conditions are present, the data will become archaeological. These are many of the digital afterlives that I have drawn out of the database of the Bach project since 2001. Two of these are what Bolter and Grusin in their 1999 book Remediation have referred to as respectful remediation. In this case, the remediated version is faithful to the form and content of the original source. Remixing Çatalhöyük, that prize-winning one, was a web exhibition of themed collections of downloadable media from the Bach project. I say was because it is now defunct, along with its Okapi server. The Last House on the Hill web edition was intended to be an introduction and a guide to the Last House on the Hill database. In 2017, it was hacked and has been inaccessible since then. Bolter and Grusin contrasted respectful remediation with radical remediation, in which the form and content of the original is disrupted. From my first adventures in the digital world, I have used digital technology to draw media-rich narratives out of the starkly academic interfaces of the primary documentation and data record of an archaeological project. The celebration of ambiguity of both archaeological data and their interpretation that enters into any narrative about the past is the life thread that runs through the tangled mass of ideas in my radical afterlives. This is done by fragmenting the long-form narrative into ever-changing juxtapositions, blurring and turning upside down the established boundaries between real, unreal, and virtual. In putting this into practice, I have been inspired by Jody Murray's book, 2007 book, Non-Discursive Rhetoric. My radical afterlives, including Rave, which was a collection of short videos that was done with live performance in combination with live performance in 2001. Now it's dead because its Mactia server became dead after Meg Conkey and I retired. Remediated Places is a series of on-site video walks at Çatalhöyük that harvested content from the database. Ahead of its time, it was quite impractical. I can't tell you now why, but we never really developed it further. In 2006, we developed Okapi Island in the virtual world of Second Life as a mirror of the East Mound at Çatalhöyük. In 2017, Okapi Island became a victim of Second Life's educational rental discount being discontinued. As you will have gathered, most of the web-based afterlives have become archaeological. Only those in simple video format that surrounds these slides here have survived, have not become archaeological, thanks to the stability of YouTube and Vimeo. Dead Women Do Tell Tales is a more elaborate afterlife that's still being developed, a game centered around networked micro-histories about Çatalhöyük, starting with Building 3. The game starts with the juxtapositioning of two timelines. The upper timeline, the world of the now, the Bach project time, proceeds in a traditional linear fashion from starting on the left in 1997 to end in 2004 on the right. The lower timeline is the world of then, the 9,000-year-old Neolithic world of the residents of the Bach area. It is read less traditionally with its start at construction of Building 3 at the right and ending with its closure and abandonment on the left. In this interface, the player has access to all the micro-histories available. I'll give you a glimpse of one, the basket, which we already met in the database. Here, in fact, on the right is an analog afterlife a chapter in a print book, Object Stories, showing some of the fragmentary narratives or vignettes based on the careful excavation of a burial pit in the Bach area, that, here, in which the phytolith basket remains are buried just above the knees of Dido, who is buried in this yellow pit. These are textual fragments juxtaposing now, taken directly from observations embedded in the official Bach project report, with others on the left there in this print version that are interpretations wrapped in the enticing clothing of imagined narratives, such as the voice of the basket itself, buried with Dido, who says, "I am a ghost, I am a shadow of myself, I have almost no substance." But then there's a present day actor who says it's outrageous anthropomorphizing. Baskets don't have voices, but they do have life histories and so on. So finally here about three tiny films. I haven't been able to turn down the sound of the films. I forgot to do that. Sorry about that. But the idea is that they mirror the narrative that is said in that print, but the digital on-screen format allows me to go way beyond the print version in terms of affect. The basket participates throughout all three mini movies with commentary, which, unlike the printed version, is entirely non-verbal, and that's also another story. I want to end with some thoughts on the priorities of curation. In the print publication process, the end product is the printed narrative, the primary afterlife of the project. As I showed in the case of the Bach project, the analog monograph was converted into digital data entities and incorporated into the Last House on the Hill database. The analog data and media were digitized. These analog data were digitized and converted into accessible, discoverable, and usable legacy data, along with the born digital data in the Last House on the Hill database. After that, the analog sources moved to the background. Perhaps they disappeared entirely, unless, and hopefully, curated for later use in redigitizing. Again, I ask you, please do not destroy your slides and tapes. The digital source data of the Bach project, safely archived with metadata organized in meaningful and useful content management systems, might be said to be the end product of publication and need to be carefully and constantly curated. The afterlives that disseminate the data in different genres and allow the broader public to interact with the primary sources are often very fragile and ephemeral. They easily become archaeological and are difficult to sustain. They may be worth curating, but are less of a priority than the database itself. Perhaps we should let them go into the great world of the internet lost world. The afterlives can be produced by other authors, as long as the source data are curated, meaningful, usable, and accessible. But I have two suggestions that might mitigate this rather gloomy perspective with reference to the afterlives of the Bach project. First, there are some afterlives whose role in enhancing and maintaining the Last House on the Hill database is so significant that an effort needs to be made to bring them out of oblivion. One such afterlife is the Last House on the Hill web edition. Perhaps Dead Women Do Tell Tales will also be one of those once it's finished. Secondly, like the Internet Archive, and as we created for remixing Çatalhöyük and for Okapi Island and for remediating places, creators of afterlives should produce at least a video tour or in-depth screenshots that can represent and preserve as a static ruin the once dynamic afterlife. And these ghost afterlives could be not only archived on YouTube, but be memorialized in an archive within the Last House on the Hill database itself. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ruth. That was wonderful. Lots of things to chew on as we transition to Brian's talk. And I welcome Brian to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. I'd like just to start by thanking Meredith and Caspar and Laura for the kind invitation to talk. I think it also was a year ago we were supposed to be speaking, and but as you say, the situation has facilitated this conversation. So thank you for suggesting that we have this conversation. And I'm particularly excited to have this discussion with Ruth. You know, I was a final year undergraduate when the book Engendering Archaeology was published in 1991. And so to read that volume, including Ruth's Households with Faces, was amazing as a student. Nothing existed like that throughout the first 10 years of post-processualism. And so Ruth, along with her colleagues, Meg and Joan, have long been archaeological heroes of mine. So this is particularly exciting for me to do this today. Okay, I'll share my screen with you now, and I'll, okay. So picking up on Ruth's point in her abstract, that about narratives that remediate or are drawn out of the primary content, I would like today to focus on the roles of the kinds of narratives that are created and are possible, future possibilities that can be drawn out when we look with an archaeological eye at archives and what we'll call for the moment ruins. Not just the material evidence, but I want to think through the idea, the conceptualization of archives and ruins, and how those narratives have operated and indeed continue to operate within the context of, firstly, colonialism, and secondly, settler colonialism in Palestine. And then I would like to offer some future-oriented thoughts about how archives and ruins should be seen not as desire or nostalgia or wreckage, but in their afterlives as containers of fragmentary records that allow unresolved histories to be written, to be brought into existence, as Ruth says, to be drawn out of the primary content. In his work, Archive Fever, Jacques Derrida distinguished between archive as, firstly, the relationships involved in memory, the writing of history, and the political authority to identify, classify, and interpret. And secondly, archive as shelter, relegating, reserving, and forgetting. Now, both of those perspectives from Derrida clearly have political utility. And the second particularly regards archive as a kind of sepulchre, a place to bury stories, to bury memories, people, and life worlds. In other words, as a ruin. And I was struck by this news item from a couple of weeks ago from the New York Times about Syrian refugees. This is something I experienced when I worked in Beirut in the 1990s, when there were Syrian refugees living in the ruins of war-damaged buildings. But what struck me about this, so it's a long-term kind of practice, but what struck me about this was the quote from the Syrian families here. Not only are they living in ruins, these archaeological sites, but they say we too have become ruins. So the people themselves have become ruins, according to these refugee families. Just using another example today from New York City, some of you might be aware of the protests that are happening at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, where various activists have organized kind of a decolonial and anti-imperial protests. And there's a guided tour happening at the weekend called The Ruins of Modernity. And the organizers invite us in their announcement to peruse MoMA's archive. They say their archives are our receipts, which is an interesting perspective. And I'll come back to that later. I want to think then firstly about this notion of ruin. In what has become a foundational text, a foundational edited volume, Anne Stoller's Imperial Debris from 2013. In that volume, Stoller and her contributing authors discuss how imperial formations, through various means, result in the production of not only the ruins of material worlds, buildings, architectures, dwellings, and so on, but also ruins of social life, of communities, of identities. They create, as Ariella Azoulay terms it in her chapter in that book on domestic space and private space in Gaza, they create the ruins of both psychic and material space. Turning to Palestine, ruins have long been a component, if you like, of particularly the European imagination of Palestine, stretching as far back into the 17th and 18th centuries. These very romanticized views of essentially a biblical past of the Palestinian landscape. Here we have some of these 18th and 19th century depictions of Jerusalem, of Ascalon, here again, and Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee down here. These European creations of a biblical past. And this is something that was rather more formalized in the 1870s with the British Palestine Exploration Fund's survey of Western Palestine, which took place 1871 to 77, a meticulous 1 inch to a mile scale survey of the biblical places. So the places that were known through the biblical texts. These places were mapped by the Palestine Exploration Fund, and they were later used as the map that resulted from that survey was later used as the map for the partition plan by the British, who took over Palestine in 1917, as we can see from these media reports. Here are the British, God bless them, at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. And so this romantic image of the landscape of Palestine continues here, as we can see. But in reality, the maps of the Survey of Western Palestine were used to create this partition map west of the River Jordan, as we can see here. And of course, this is the map of the modern day state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza over here. On the ground, this map was then used as the new territory by the established state of Israel in 1948, which of course was accompanied by the displacement of 250,000 Palestinians from their villages over the course of a year from 1948. This isn't, you probably can't read this, but all the place names in red are the between 400 and 500 Palestinian villages that were subject to displacement by the new Israeli state. And this archive, if you like, of these villages is something that there has been a great deal of focus on over the years. And as you can see here, the displacement of the Arab villages not only was a physical displacement, but it's also, as Zule says, it's a psychic displacement. It creates these invisibilities, if you like. The place names were changed, Arab place names were changed. You can see here Moshe Dayan, the head of the Israeli Defense Force in 1969, so some 20 years later, discussing how Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. And he discusses the changing place names. There's not one single place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. And the recording of that depopulation was the focus of this monumental piece of work by the Palestinian scholar Walid Khalidi. This was published in 1992 and was a result of some decades of detailed work, ethnographic, historical work on the landscapes of depopulated Palestine. And in this book, Khalidi records in great detail the 417, 420 villages that were abandoned or destroyed in 1948. These are rather murky black and white pictures, but there's no digital version of this. This is the archive we have, the published archive. So some buildings were left to turn into ruins, like these buildings here, religious buildings largely. And domestic dwellings, houses. Some were converted into other uses, turned into houses, factories, synagogue in one case here. And some of them were completely disappeared and replaced by parks and other public amenities. But they were recorded, so we have this archive. Now, what I'm interested in here is the idea in the title of Khalidi's book, which is called All That Remains. And I would like you just to hold that for the discussion later, this notion of remains as opposed to ruins. The villages have been the subject of a number of other studies since Khalidi's work. Probably the most well-known is Rochelle Davis's book called Palestinian Village Histories, which we at the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia are in the process of digitizing these village memorial books. Many of these villages have these individual books written by their former inhabitants, some mostly by men, some by women, younger women. But Rochelle Davis recounts these, and she has actually purchased and bought a number of these village memorial books over the years, and she has very generously donated them to us at the Center for Palestine Studies. And we have some of these are already up on our website. You can see here these different villages that were occupied up until 1948. So this is a digital archive in the process of being created, where these hopefully will all be. She has around 120 of them, but I think there are probably more than 200 in existence. So this is an ongoing project of digitizing these accounts of these of village life pre-1948. Now, since the Oslo Accords of 1993, I'm sure you're aware that the West Bank has been divided into 3 areas A, B, and C. Area C is under full Israeli control. And there are a number of key archaeological sites in that area, including the Qumran caves, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are located. So Area C. Area B is under joint Israeli and Palestinian control, and the smallest area in terms of percentage, Area A, is under full Palestinian control, which is most of the main towns like Ramallah, Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, and so on. And this is becoming smaller and smaller as we speak. Not to mention the fact that the entire West Bank is surrounded by a 30-foot concrete security barrier, of course. But my sort of purpose here, and here is the West Bank as it is today. You can see all these blue areas, which are in fact under full Palestinian control. So they're being broken up into smaller and smaller portions of land, and so the landscape itself is being divided up. But my concern here is with what do we do with this material when we come across it in our archaeological work. And this is a project that I was involved in 2004, 2005, when it had become rather impossible to work in the West Bank due to the Second Intifada. And a Palestinian colleague who works for the Israel Antiquities Authority, one of the very few Palestinians who work for the Israel Antiquities Authority, invited me to carry out a small prehistoric survey in the Upper Jordan Valley, so just south of the Lebanese border, an area that hadn't undergone archaeological survey. But what we found was, in surveying this area and looking for prehistoric sites ostensibly, was that we continually, day after day, hour after hour, came across the remains of these pre-1948 villages and landscapes. So the rural settlement, if you like, of Palestine pre-1948. And so we took this decision to alter the strategy of the survey in a sense, and we decided just to record these in great detail. Although they'd been recorded by Khalidi, they had not been recorded archaeologically. They had just been recorded as dots on maps, if you like. So we started recording the buildings and the cemeteries and the agricultural landscapes. Some of these remains are here rather, very visible in the landscape. Some of them are remains of agricultural buildings or facilities such as wells and things like that, animal enclosures and so on. But some of them were rather more substantial and rather hidden away, if you like. Some of these sites, these villages, are only locatable. There's one good archaeological indicator, actually. If you see these sabra, prickly pear, the cactus, usually indicate ancient village boundaries, and you can see them here. And this is Yabi Musa in the Upper Jordan Valley, which is the remains of one of these abandoned villages and their religious buildings and a cemetery. So we recorded this too. And this was evacuated. This is Professor Zoe Crossland from Columbia University recording. And this is just off the Jordan Valley Road, but it's very hidden from sight. It's in a kind of dip. But that's not to say what happened here in 1948 is not actually memorialized or recorded. Because although the cemetery and the village is not visible from the roadside and is not mentioned in any on any signs or anything like that, in those trees just above it, there are a number of memorials which are placed by by the Israelis. So this is this memorial telling us about the 1948 evacuation, as they call it, of the Galilee. And this is the narrative about the Israeli soldiers, 28 of whom I believe were killed in their confrontation with the inhabitants of the village. And what is interesting is this is 2004, 2005, this picture. But when I revisited a couple of years ago, the memorial has been renewed and replaced by this stone version, which tells the same story, but in a bit more detail. And there is also this memorial in the forest, in the wood clearing here. So it's interesting, this replacement of the old monument, this metal one here from the late 60s, I believe that was put up, with this new one, underscores the point that, you know, the settler colonialism is in fact an ongoing process. There is no post-colonial in Palestine. Now, of course, as scholars, we are faced with the post-colonial in terms of theory and the conceptual apparatus that we can draw upon. But is it appropriate? This is the website of the newly established Society of Palestinian Anthropologists in Saniat. And Insaniat have been in operation for about 2 years now. They're funded from a number of sources, including the Wenner Gren, who gave them a generous grant to get started, and also the Palestine American Research Council, PARC. And they've held 2 or 3 conferences already. You can see here the call for their 3rd conference later this year. But Insaniat have exposed this kind of dilemma, if you like, that faces Palestinians and people working on Palestine in terms of the kinds of concepts that we want to use when re-excavating an archive, thinking about past ruins and remains and so on. And they invite us to engage with that material, but by using different epistemologies, not the epistemologies of the global north. They don't want to simply import anthropological concepts and frameworks from the global north. And there's a lot of discussion amongst Palestinian scholars and scholars of Palestine about this. And this is something I've been sort of struggling with when I look at these archives over the last few years and in my engagement with Insaniat and with this archaeological material. I'd like just to highlight a few of these for the second part of this talk. If we think about some of the linguistic aspects. Now, in Arabic, the word ruins is athar. And the word for archaeology is ilm al-athar, which is the science of ruins, the study of ruins. And so archaeology, as a definition in Arabic, is the science of ruins, the subject of ruins. We study ruins and archaeology. So we're already faced with a difficulty here when we want to start thinking about indigenous concepts, using, trying to think about other ways of thinking about the past, these past landscapes, these ruins, this material. We have to try and separate out ruins and archaeology, but it's built in, the idea of ruin is built into the very definition, the very word of archaeology. And I think, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, most archaeologists don't tend to conceptualize the study of the material worlds that we study. We don't tend to conceptualize the study of those material worlds as the study of ruins. We talk about archaeological evidence. We talk about the archaeological record. And we do talk about fragments. but maybe not in the sense of ruin. We talk about them more in a sort of theoretically nuanced sort of sense these days, maybe more in the Benjamin sort of way of thinking about, you know, Benjamin encouraged us to think about fragments in his Arcades project, to think about fragments from the past and how we might revitalize them. And increasingly we talk about trace and traces. And of course that brings in the forensic in the sense of, you know, the kind of work that's being done by forensic architecture, not in the scientific forensic sense. But we routinely conceptualize our inquiries into past material worlds as the study of archaeological remains. And I'm returning here to Khalidi's term. Not ruins. We don't really talk about ruins, we talk about remains. And so I think there's something there that we can worry at, and remains, things that stay, people that stay in place, remain, not simply as a residue or a remnant or as a leftover or as vestigial, because the people remain and their descendants remain, either in 48 Palestine or in the diaspora, as do their identities, their memories and their histories. And this is very much part of the Palestinian notion of perseverance, of resistance, and of resilience. Even the cactus I showed you, the cactus, the sabra, is symbolic of Palestinian resistance. So there's something to be worked at here in terms of the resonances of the idea of remain rather than ruin. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just want to go back there. So this idea of remain, to stay in place, not to be displaced. And I just want to make a similar point about, I wanted to say also that this notion of traces is also being connected to archive. And this is just an example, a brilliant example of a piece of research from medical anthropology and other disciplines, traces of the future with an eye to the future, looking at colonial archives in Africa in particular. So I've been thinking, using some ideas from this. So connecting this to archive. So, and we can see a connection between remain and trace and archive coming through in some disciplines. Now, when we look at the Arabic word for archive, an important point to make here is that there is no indigenous term in Arabic for archive. It's the European term. This term at the top, it reads archive. Okay, archive. It's from the French archive. So it's a European term. And again, so there, you know, we need some kind of indigenous sort of concept to try and replace this with, to think about it. And I've been kind of sort of playing around with, you know, different Arabic words and verb roots. All Arabic verbs have a root. And I've been thinking about this one here, verb root, which is sajal, S-J-L, S-J-L, sajal, which really refers to all forms of recording, to record, to register, to inscribe, to archive. It even means, in some senses, history, to record a history of something. So again, there's something here to worry about in terms of thinking about concepts that are more appropriate to Southern epistemologies, if you like, Palestinian epistemologies, rather than importing these epistemologies of the North, that we may call them. This is the use of this term, sajal, again, to be registered. Interestingly, not only does it sometimes mean to register, to record, to archive, to document, it can also mean to contend and to dispute, to contest. So this idea of contested landscape, contended landscapes, I think there's something in here that we might be able to develop and work with. Anyway, that's just some ideas on that. And finally, staying with this concern about using the epistemologies of the North at the expense of indigenous frameworks, this is something that relates in an important way to the anti-colonial or anti-settler colonial struggle in Palestine. And we can see this very clearly in the different languages used in the discourse of heritage. Incidentally, heritage site and archaeological site are often interchangeable in Arabic. They often both refer to a site of ruin. And again, I'm trying to argue against this use of this term ruin and instead replace it with remain. But looking at one specific example, just to finish with, this is an example that has been written about recently by my colleague Rana Barakat from Birzeit University, professor of history at Birzeit. And she has been looking at the village of Lifta, which is just northwest of Jerusalem. And Lifta is one of the Palestinian villages that was not destroyed in 1948. It certainly does remain. But for many decades, Lifta, because of its unusual circumstance, has been drawn into the heritage discourse of Israeli settler colonialism. And despite several Palestinian families still living there, remaining, and more than 50 standing structures remaining, parts of the village have been subjected to various processes of preservation, so-called, and restoration for Israeli and foreign tourists, what Barakat refers to in her recent article as museumification. And I'll come back to that. And this process of preservation and restoration has placed the village and its inhabitants in a kind of static history. I'm just pulling out some of the terms here from the Israeli tourist literature and from the media. Lifta is frozen in time. It's a ghost village, a paved paradise, a Garden of Eden, a Palestinian Pompeii, and so on. So this categorization by heritage as the only remaining abandoned Palestine village, in this kind of settler narrative of the place, it becomes framed as a story of preservation. Lifta's story, I'm quoting Barakat here, Lifta's story of preservation is a drama full of all kinds of actors, from settlers who want to be natives, settlers who want to make their own style of native chic, natives who are metamorphosed and who in some ways and instances metamorphosed themselves into folk stories, and off this stage framed by the settler and imperial powers, indigenous Palestinians who want to return. And so Barakat presents a remarkable discussion of this so-called unique circumstances of Lifta. And you can see Lifta here. This is a 19th century German depiction of it on the lower left. This is it here, just northwest of, you can see the outskirts of Jerusalem in the background here. And we can see, interestingly here, two different signposts to Lifta. One using the Anglified name of the biblical name in Neftoa, one using the Hebrew name, and as you can see, the Arabic name for Lifta has been scratched off the signpost by settlers. As I say, Barakat presents a remarkable discussion of the circumstances of Lifta, and she tackles the extremely complex question of how to engage in the debate in terms other than those laid out and used by the settler colonial oppressor. In other words, the epistemologies of the settler narrative. Because to engage on those terms would be to normalize relations. But I'm not sure that using the idea of museumification is the most productive here. Barakat takes the term museumification from Gregory Ashworth, a professor of heritage management from the late 1990s, but actually it originally comes from Baudrillard It comes from Simulacra and Simulation, 1981. And it was certainly a relevant critique of the commodification of history, of the past, and certainly of a lot of museum practice. But since the important critiques of scholars such as Amy Lonetree and others who over the past decade have laid out the obligations of a decolonized museum, and I think a great many museum-related scholars, professionals, and disciplines are rapidly rising to that challenge, as we've seen recently, removal of monuments and so on. Museums are not places where troublesome things can be hidden or left to ossify, to mummify in Baudrillard's terms. So to continue to use a term like museumification detracts from these new obligations. And I think that any discussion of the role of museums going forward as we enter the third decade of the 21st century needs to take this on board. Museums are in the process of being transformed, and so museumification as an idea should now belong to the old narrative, and in this case, in the case of Palestine, to the settler colonial narrative. I think it does a great disservice to scholars, students, and professionals who are trying to change those institutions, take away its power. It's now irrelevant as a concept, museumification. Look to the present and look to the future. And this comes back to Derrida again, who I started with, and thinking about the potentialities of other worlds that are possible through our engagement with these extant archives, these village archives, if you like. Derrida says the question of the archive is not, we repeat, not a question of the past. It's a question of the future. The question of the future itself, the question of a response, of a promise, and a responsibility for tomorrow. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these wonderful talks. Very rich, lots to think of, and lots of connections as we anticipated. I now invite the panel to make themselves, the members of the panels, to make themselves visible. And I'm hoping also that the participants who are not on the panel might be willing to share some questions on the Q&A function. I see that we have sort of 10 past, so I'm not going to start off. Does someone from the panel would like to kick off with a question?
I see Rosemary and Karen.
Hi, everyone.
Can I ask, I think Karen was first, or I haven't quite seen it clearly. Karen Rubinson?
Unmute.
Yes,
Okay.
you're unmuted now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I thank everybody, thank the speakers, thank you, Caspar and Meredith, for inviting me to participate. And I'm not going to take on one of the big issues right now. I want to address something that Ruth said, which is this ephemeral nature of the derived web-based discussions or stories that disappear. And I have two thoughts about that. One is to think, you suggested, Ruth, that one should take a video of such a thing. And what came to my mind as you were discussing it, is these can be ephemeral, like a museum exhibition, if we're going to talk about museums too. And there are a variety of ways that people preserve the memory of the exhibition, besides producing the book, the catalog. And photography and video are two of those tools. So if you think about them as temporary exhibits, if you will, that makes sense to me. And I will tell you that, having run into a situation recently while I was writing a book and needed some data that disappeared on the web, the Wayback Machine is wonderful. And so if you want to go back and record those things that have vanished, the Wayback Machine is like a miracle. So I recommend that as a tool. For those of you who don't know Wayback Machine, just type it into Google and tell them what you're looking for. And it goes back through, they've been recording forever, and it's all there. So at least for the moment. I mean, you know, we're still talking about digital preservation having some kinds of limits, but at the moment it's all there. That's so, I'll stop now.
Okay, I'm really interested that, Karen, that you compared the afterlife of, you know, the digital things with something like the temporary museum exhibits, because I think that it's definitely would be for many people, and it a much more not only visual but a real real feeling, multisensorial feeling of what that museum exhibit was like. And I haven't ever seen, or very rarely seen, anything like that. And that is something that could be this idea of a ghost-like representation of what was. It's not the same thing at all. And talking about the Wayback Machine, which is what I sort of think of the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, they're very closely related. When Last House on the Hill became hacked, I used Wayback Machine for getting screenshots. The trouble is they only take the surface of your site. So I couldn't get more than, I think, 1 or 2 levels of that website out of the Wayback Machine. I mean, it's certainly better than nothing. And our problem with the website was that we didn't do a tour through all of the levels, and we should have done. We just didn't expect it to happen. It's like having an earthquake before you realize your house is going to fall down. Oh my God, I should have been told, you know, done a view of all the things that I'm going to lose. It's for insurance and so on. Right. It's a kind of idea that you don't think these things are going to happen, and then they do. So anyway, but it's a really, this idea of you have this archive of these things, but just to know that they are not the same. There's a limited use. They are like, not sure. I sort of was trying to think what would be their equivalent in what Brian was talking about, of these ghost-like, you know, to take photographs of these, the heritage, or have the photographs of the living house at the time before it was moved, before the population was moved, is really valuable, but it's not the same as the life itself. And this is the biggest problem. I think it's a really huge challenge and a wonderful one.
It's about memory in that sense. So.
Yes.
We had Rosemary next.
Well, first of all, thank you again for this incredibly stimulating talks, and to the Center for organizing it. There are about 1 million things that just the last things that Ruth said make me want to engage with. I'll say one very brief thing about that and then turn to what I was beginning with, which is, I think as archaeologists, we have a particular way of looking at the world that actually encounters us in fragments, and trying to see through it to a kind of whole that is the ghost. And I don't see the fragments as the ghost. I see the original as the ghost, which I think you do in your video presentations. And that leads me to the echoes that I heard between both of these talks that are very stimulating, which is the repeated return to remains, and the question of how we think of things that are material traces, to use the language that I use as well, Brian, how to think about them having ongoing power, having ongoing meaning, and a implication of your very strong, and I think I think I agree completely, rejection of museumification as a good term for contemporary use. Brings me back to Ruth's use of curation. And I think that what you're directing us to, and that we might all think about, is the role that we have collectively as curators of these material things and the knowledges that are created around them, which is independent of the medium. It doesn't matter whether it's the analog thing or the digital thing. And they're perhaps in a hopeful mode, because I think there's a certain elegiac mode that comes out when we talk about this, the loss, the death, the ghostliness. Your stories are both stories of how much still remains in place as a consequence, not just of some inert thing called memory, but of the practices of curation. And as you were talking, I kept coming back to the idea that this foregrounds curation as an active process of producing ongoing visions around fragments, where the fragments, the archival fragmentariness is the condition of existence. And I wondered, am I hearing, just because I'm hearing the two of you back to back, am I hearing something in both of your projects that isn't really there? Is this kind of move, this urging on Ruth's part that we need to take remediation seriously and we need to be responsible curators, this urging on Brian's part that we curate all these different kinds of things? Does this capture what you're trying to say?
I'll let Brian go first, and then I got something to say too.
I think you're right, Ruth, actually. Sorry, Rosemary, yeah. If I can, could I just stick with this idea of the ephemeral for a second, because Karen raised it, and I think it also relates to what Rosemary's asking there. I've got a lot of time for this idea of the ephemeral and the ghost-like, particularly in what we're talking about here today, because I was trying to think about when I was kind of railing against this idea of museumification, which I'm glad you were with me on that, Rosemary. I was trying to think what kinds of things can evade museumification or evade appropriation. And I was trying to think of, those things that are ephemeral or transitory or temporary, these ghost-like representations. These are things that can evade appropriation by, say, colonial authorities, for example. And there are people, there are some people who are doing things in these villages that I spoke about, or amongst the ruins, amongst the remains. Some people have weddings there. There are art happenings there. There's an amazing, you may be familiar with these Neolithic stone masks that have been found or appropriated. There have been these kind of flash mobs and happenings and improvisations by artists taking place in these villages, things like that. These are things that can't be appropriated and can't be museumified, if you like. And so how do we record those? How do we archive them even? I like the fact that they get away from us and they can't be captured. So maybe there's something to be said for the ephemeral. Maybe we don't have to record everything, or shouldn't. Yeah.
Well, I was going to. I was also thinking of a lot of what you were talking about, Brian, was more the kind of tangible remains on the surface, rather
Right.
than stuff that archaeologists have brought up out of the ground or whatever. And that's another problem, but it's very different. And I was thinking of the whole idea of how do things become ephemeral. They are ephemeral. Some are ephemeral because they only last a short time. But you were also talking about ruins. How do they become ephemeral? How do they, or not ephemeral, but how do they become ruins? How do they sort of become what we see as empty, dark, static, no longer live things, buildings or whatever? And it comes back to this whole a really interesting point that Laura Jane Smith, I think, and others have made about heritage sites, that to preserve them is not actually to preserve them at all. As you're talking about with museumification, it's to freeze them.
Exactly, yeah.
And they become static and dead as much as anything else which is frozen to death.
Yeah.
But what she was saying, there's a difference between preservation and conservation, and that to conserve, in some definitions of heritage, to conserve a building is to keep it alive. And it's the same thing of keeping the data alive, or keeping, in my talk, or the database, and keeping even something like some of the a server which has some of these things on it, keep that alive because it's being used. It's being there's a purpose for it. It's being accessed by different people. It has a live purpose. It's a place for weddings, you know, and or whatever. It's not, obviously not, that's referring back to your talk, but anyway, so that's how I see this idea of, or the problem of, and the curation aspect is that you curate by making sure that it is always being used, it is always being accessed. It's part of life, ongoing life.
Yeah, and that use and that ongoing life in the circumstances that I'm talking about is often a digital one. It's often online. It's often the Palestinian diaspora in America or South America or wherever that are keeping those villages alive, the memories of them and things like that. Yeah, yeah. They're not physically being there. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I was thinking the life, keeping it alive, is done not through changing or preserving the tangible, but it's creating the intangible heritage around it,
Exactly.
which may not have anything to do with what was originally, but it's a different kind.
Yeah, that's very well put. Yeah.
And then I think Yanis had his hand up next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Caspar and Meredith, for the invitation.
Hello, Yanis.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Yanis.
I'm joining you from Athens, and the time is 1:30 in the morning. So I apologize in advance if what I'm going to ask doesn't sound very coherent. But I did enjoy both presentations, and I was struck by how connected they are, how the threads are actually the same, and how you've managed to talk about similar issues. So along those lines, and along what Ruth just said in her response, I was wondering whether a key part of the whole process is how we actually curate and how we actually upload things on the archive, because that moment is in fact crucial in what's going to happen later, to whether these things are going to be reactivated, become alive again, on whether what I call the sensorial field is going to be able to be alive again, reactivated. Because as we know, there are lots of archives that are dead archives, there are dead repositories of material, and it's extremely difficult to engage with their affective power because of many, political as well as curatorial issues. And also because in the original process of creating them, there wasn't any concern to actually engage the sensorial qualities and affordances of the material in the first place. So I wanted to ask you both, how would you think we could actually safeguard for that? How can we ensure that the multisensoriality of the material in the first place becomes active and remains active throughout, and allows for other people who are going to come after us to actually re-engage with it in an effective way?
Do you want to go first, Ruth? Because I think mine's a little complicated.
Okay. I think part of what you're talking about, Yanis, is very much what is being written about by a lot of people interested in digital archives database and so on. The Sarah and Eric Kanzer, Jeremy Huggett, and a lot of the people around. I mean, I was at a conference with a lot of them last, I don't know, God, it was 2019. It was, but it seems like yesterday. But anyway, these people, what everybody is saying in terms of the database or the archive to keep it alive is that it needs to be not only accessed, access isn't enough. Let the person download a document about a site or a set of documents about a site. It's not enough. It's first of all, the person might not know what they're looking for. And if they do, they might not be able to use it in the state that it's in. It might be in a kind of format that is impossible. That's the problem with a lot of 3D models and other things that have been created. But so what they're all saying is it has to be made more than just accessible. It's got to be attractive, to be usable. And for that, what my argument was, and I think still is, and hasn't been talked about a lot, which is, how do you know about the data? How do you know about the archive? How do you know what's in there? And that's what a lot of archives are missing to a great extent. They're assuming that you know what you're looking for, and you know how to find it. What you want to really keep an archive like a museum alive is to know, to be broadly broadcast what's in there. Why is it meaningful? Why would you be interested in it? And that was my whole point, that's where to a large extent, that interest is going to be garnered by websites, but also by publications, by people writing in the media of different kinds about it. I've discovered this, I've discovered that, and so on. So the discoverability is a big issue at the moment in terms of digital archives, and I suspect probably a lot of analog archives, although I think that publication, it's never been such a problem with publication, because you have references at the end which are how you find what you're looking for, how you know where to go in the archive of the world's libraries. But so that's my response to, I'm not sure if that was that okay for you, Yanis? Did you kind of?
I know that you and I share a keen interest in multisensoriality, and I know that in your own work, you have been very keen in incorporating from the very beginning the sensorial affordances of your material to allow other people afterwards to re-energize them and become, for them to become effective again. But that's not something that many other people do. As you say, it's kind of uploading stuff or keeping stuff for them is enough, whereas you have shown that that's not enough. If you don't incorporate from the very beginning that affectivity and sensoriality, then it's very difficult later for others to re-energize them. And
that's a really good point. And that is, how do you make sure that other people know how to remix images into something else, how to make them interested. And that's what I'm saying, is the database itself, the archive itself won't do that. It's got to be stuff that is written by people who know what's in the archive, playing around with it. But I don't know that that's what is ephemeral and should not be.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I don't know what the answer to your question is. Maybe Brian does.
No, not at all. But I just think that in the particular circumstances I'm working in here, the idea of sharing and access is a huge political issue, obviously. I mean, there's a great deal of digitized colonial archives from the British Mandate, for example. But they were digitized and are held by Israeli institutions. And, you know, Palestinian scholars don't have access to them, or it's very, very difficult to get access to them. I could get access to some of them, but my Palestinian colleagues would find it immensely difficult to get access. The idea of sharing that archive with Palestinian scholars is not one that's routine. Yeah.
One thing I was going to just add for Yanis's question was that reminded me that some of the most successful use we made out of the media from Çatalhöyük, or from the Bach project, was combining it with live performance. And I think that is something that there's not much of. It's very successful, you know, people who've done experimental performances using archaeological materials. It can be fantastic, but it's not usually linked to, well, you're interested, you can do something like this. Here's where we got the images from. You can get those same images. You can do this kind of thing. But there has to be some sort of guidance so that it's not like a free-for-all how you use it, I think.
Yeah, that was that example I used of the artistic performance and with the masks.
Yes, yeah.
It was really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, we're officially 3 minutes overtime, and we had one more question in the chat. Peter Miller had his hand up. Is it a question that can be answered sort of within reasonable time?
Yeah, I realize that we're in stoppage time, so we'll play it like that. It's really for Professor Boyd. General admiration for both of the talks. 3 points, and I'll be super brief. The whole question of counter languages for the study of the past interests me a great deal. I think the example of the resistance of Jinshishui in China, stone and bronze studies, and its relationship to archaeology is fairly well studied and provides a really good context for the kinds of thing you're interested in.
Brilliant.
The second point is really in 2 points about the resistances of language and how fraught these questions are. So remains, the term that you're liking, was itself given sharp-edged content by Droysen in 1857 in his lectures on the study of the past, and became a staple for German historical scholarship. Überreste remains, and it's contrasted with sources and monuments, each of which is also given specific definitions. So in fact, it's a deeply imperialist term that you're using, which brings me to the third point, which is archaeology itself, as you know, has a much more complicated and nuanced past than its, let's say, simple-minded critics might view. In the deeper past, it was just the study of the past, old things, and it ran like that through the Renaissance. And even in the 19th century, when it was assigned to the foundation of a new discipline, it was itself the insurgent term against history, which was seen as the monopolistic authoritarian regime. So I think, there's an ebb and flow in all of these languages, and what makes them interesting is that they can be reoccupied. It's not that they're ever off limits.
Yeah, exactly. No, point taken. Yeah, I like this idea of reappropriating the language, but I didn't. The Chinese example is fascinating, so I'd like to follow that up. Yeah.
Well, I think it is time to draw to a close. It was a really great pair of lectures, presentations. We had a good discussion, and we very much look forward to hopefully next time in person when Archaeological Encounters meets again in the coming academic year. Thank you very much for being with us, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.